Port Phillip Stevedores Association had their rooms in Bay Street. It had a fully refurbished library. It was a licensed premises. They had 2 pool rooms. They did 2 full-size billiard tables. They did a pick-up there, and they did it once a day. So they'd know by 10 o'clock if they were working. After the BB Award came in, they had to line up what was called Hogan's Flat here. Before all this was built here, there was nothing. There was no shelter from the wind, the rain, or the heat, and they'd have to line up here for 2 pickups a day. So they'd have to wait until 3 o'clock in the afternoon to find out whether they had a job or not. At the time on the November 2nd, it was a Friday morning, they've been lining up, 1,200 men lining up all week to get a job. Not one of them has got a job. A trainload of scabs come from free labourers. Scabs. They came off the Port Melbourne station. They were actually met with all the wives of the waterside workers saying, "You're taking our husband's work, our kids have got no food to eat, and give them what for," in a spirited fashion. They were marched by the police across the pier onto Princess Pier and started working on the pier. And you can imagine the anger of these blokes that's been their work, that's how they feed their families. And they rushed onto the pier. There was a bit of biffo. One of the organisers said, "Come on, get back, get back." When the Chief Inspector Mossop ran up with him behind the cane, started whacking him over the head and calling him for everything. So the blokes turned. He said, "No, get back, get back." They actually started all walking off the pier then, towards the end of the pier, when shots, up to I think 80 shots were fired, so a lot of them were firing in the air. The 4 people were shot. Alan Whittaker, he got shot. It wasn't the first time he'd been shot at the beach. The first time he was in April the 25th, on Anzac Day, on the first wave of the Gallipoli landing. He spent 80 days in hospital, recovered, and as most of these blokes here, they were returned veterans from the First World War. If they were alive today, they'd all been hailed as heroes. They weren't at the time. The newspapers call them cowardly mob and all these things. So it's good that we look back at these events and we have a look at and see, we can judge them in the hindsight of history, the actions of them, the actions of the Prime Minister, the Police Commissioner, and see who was sticking up for Australia in Australia's best interest. We've just got Chief Justice, retired Chief Justice Frank Vincent, whose father was a waterside workers member and grew up in Port Melbourne, to tell you about growing up in Port Melbourne and the history of his father.
Never quite cracked the Chief Justice job, but that was their mistake, I think. It's interesting to hear these events described as history, because they're not history to me. I was born in Port Melbourne less than 9 years after these events. Members of my family, of course, were on the picket line at the time that they occurred. There were other members of my family, the women, and indeed my mother was a runner at that time for a wonderful old suffragette called Jenny Bain, who was a community worker organising resistance and notifying when the scabs were arriving in the Port Melbourne area. It was a devastating time for people. And of course, as I said, growing up in that union family right here in the middle of this tight-knit community of Port Melbourne, although I wasn't born at the time, I was almost always there. I never knew a time at which I did not know what occurred, and never a time at which I did not understand what those men were struggling for. The conditions that you must recognise, of course realise now, were appalling. And they were appalling even during my period as I grew up watching and seeing my father and the sort of work that his mates and he had to carry out at that time. And of course, it has a particular sting for me because he died at 61 of what were euphemistically described as compensable diseases. In other words, he had lungs full of shit. And that was a product of years of work on the waterfront, not only here in Melbourne but also in Tasmania. It's interesting to hear that short history in another sense, because of course initially after the 28th strike the union was effectively decimated. It was really, really badly damaged. And by 1934, there were only a little over 800 members left in the Melbourne branch of the Waterside Workers' Federation. It was said and believed at the time that these were a quiet rump who would disappear in the fullness of time. But a strange thing occurred, something that was not predicted by the government or by the ship owners or others at the time, and that was that the lead that entered the bodies of workers on that day was transformed into steel in the soles of a new union. And that union developed a kind of militancy which was new. And the Waterside Workers' Federation to that time had been fragmented with issues arising between the various states and local bodies. And it too transformed into a united union. And a union which was concerned, as I've always seen it, as being associated not only with the individual rights and working conditions of its members, but with the broader social context, political and economic, within which those issues have arisen. And during the time that I grew up connected with this union, I saw them engaged in a wide range of activities that they were vilified for, but nevertheless represented very serious struggles. The struggles which were taking place against the colonial powers in Asia. The Waterside Workers' Federation early became involved in the enforcement and protection of Indigenous rights. You saw lots of activities with respect to the work and solidarity with the broader trade union movement and broader social issues in a way which was new, and I think very, very represents a history and a tradition of which we can be extremely proud. I think my favourite Waterside strike occurred in about 1956. After an enormous amount of industrial dispute and years of struggle, double shifting was finally being outlawed, and men were no longer required to work the extraordinary hours in order to finish boats and so forth. And it was discovered, because they still had horses moving cargoes from the ships into the sheds down here, that this change had not been given to the horses, and that some of these poor animals were still working extended hours beyond those of the waterside workers. So what the men did was put paint on the hooves of some of the horses to check to see if the horses were being double shifted. They then discovered that they had been, and so they went on strike for the horses. And the proposition that they put forward was that if men have to work like horses, then horses shouldn't have to work longer than men. But it is a proud tradition, and it's one which I have been honoured to associate myself with over the years. I've now just retired from the Supreme Court bench, but I suspect that I will remain the only judge who is a life member of the MUA. I owe a lot to this union and to this community of Port Melbourne, and I hope that I have never indicated that I've ever forgotten it. Thanks.